It took 4 men getting injured until they realized just how wrong they'd been about me. For 15 years, I've been the top senior industrial electrician at the company, just like my dad had been before his injury. Unfortunately, not everyone thinks I deserve the spot. And last Tuesday was a prime example of it. My boss had sent me out to inspect a manufacturing plant across town after they called about an emergency. Their main production line's down. They're losing $3 million each hour, and none of the men they hired could figure out what's causing the machinery to malfunction like this. So I'm sending you because I know if anyone can do it, it's you, my boss insisted. I pulled up to the facility, grabbed my toolkit, and headed straight for the main entrance. The plant manager took one look at me and blocked the doors. Wait, you're the electrician? I nodded and held up my credentials. Yep, 15 years experience. Where's the problem? He crossed his arms. Look, no offense, but we need someone who actually knows what they're doing. This is serious industrial equipment. I felt my jaw tighten. Lucky for you because I'm certified for industrial systems like this. He paused, studying my face, then burst out into laughter. I didn't know they gave certifications like that to women. Aren't the tools too heavy for you? Anyway, enough with the jokes. Call your company and tell them to send a man down here to fix this. I felt my blood boil at his condescending tone. They won't be sending anyone else because I'm already the best there is. He rolled his eyes. Look, this isn't some toy or fashion thing. This is heavy machinery. It's not for little ladies like you. I took a deep breath to calm myself before pushing past him into the facility. I'm already here. Just show me the equipment. He started leading the way, his face still scrunched up bitterly. When we reached the production floor, I immediately saw the problem. The main transformer was showing heat damage and the safety systems were completely bypassed. I knelt down and inspected the wiring and felt all the blood from my body drain instantly. This wasn't just broken. This was dangerous. You need to shut everything down right now, I said, standing up. This transformer's been running without proper cooling for weeks. The insulation's degraded, and if you try to restart it, you're risking an arc flash. The plant manager laughed. Are you serious right now? We're losing millions. We just need to get it running. I pulled out my phone and showed him the thermal readings. Look at these heat signatures. This is critical. The standard fix would be replacing the transformer entirely, but you can't do that because someone bypassed all your safety interlocks. If anyone goes near this thing when it's energized, they could die, I said in a single rushed breath. He grinned at my panicked expression and called over his maintenance crew. Hey guys, apparently we've got a major crisis here because the lady's scared of a little heat. He mocked. They all laughed. One of them, a guy named Dustin, walked right up to the transformer. Ma'am, I've been working here 20 years. This equipment's tough. We just need to reset the breakers and boost the cooling. I stepped between him and the panel. No, you don't understand. The cooling system failure caused the insulation to break down. You can't just reset this. You need to replace it. The plant manager pulled me aside. Listen, sweetheart, we appreciate you coming out here, but we've got trained guys who know this equipment. Why don't you let the men handle it? I felt my hands shaking. I am trained. This is literally what I do. You called me because your guys couldn't fix it. He waved me off. Yeah, well, we thought we were getting actual help. I realized they weren't going to listen to me. So I grabbed my tools and installed a temporary safety bypass to at least prevent electrocution if someone touched it. When I finished, I stood up and looked at the plant manager. This is just a safety measure. It buys you maybe 30 seconds before the whole thing fails. Do not turn this machine on. You need a full replacement. Dustin looked at the new wiring and grinned. Looks like the lady can fix things after all. Let's get the machine running, boys. Dustin and 3 other electricians started suiting up in their arc flash gear. I grabbed the plant manager's arm and begged, stop them. Please, it's not completely fixed. Someone's going to get hurt. He shook me off. You're being hysterical. This is exactly why we don't hire women. Too emotional over nothing. Dustin flipped the main breaker. The transformer hummed to life. The production line started moving. The plant manager turned to me with this smug smile. See? Nothing to worry about. You girls always think the sky's falling. I kept my phone pressed to my ear, watching the equipment. Turn it off. Please just turn it off. The hum got louder. Then I saw it. A small arc of electricity jumping between contacts. Get back! I screamed. Dustin laughed. Relax, it's just a little spark. Suddenly, the whole panel exploded in a flash of white light. 2 guys went flying backwards. Dustin collapsed, screaming. The entire building went dark. I sprinted toward Dustin and another guy who were closest to the blast. I grabbed Dustin under his arms and dragged him away from the panel, just as another explosion ripped through the transformer. The sirens arrived 3 minutes later, just as a third blast erupted. This time, not everyone made it out safely. Not even me. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed with my arms wrapped in thick white bandages and this constant ringing in my ears that wouldn't stop no matter how hard I tried to shake it off. The fluorescent lights above me felt too bright and everything looked fuzzy around the edges. A nurse appeared next to my bed and started checking the monitors beeping beside me. I tried to sit up, but pain shot through my entire body, and I fell back against the pillows. My throat felt raw and dry when I finally managed to speak. Dustin. Is Dustin okay? The nurse's face changed and she pressed a button on the wall before telling me the doctor would be in soon to talk to me. That's when I knew something really bad had happened. The doctor came in about 10 minutes later holding a clipboard and pulled up a chair next to my bed. He explained that I had second-degree burns on both forearms where I'd grabbed Dustin and dragged him away from the panel. The blast pressure gave me a concussion and damaged my hearing, which explained the constant ringing that was driving me crazy. Then he paused and his voice got quieter. 2 workers died in the explosions. 2 men who went to work that Tuesday morning and never came home. 3 others, including Dustin, were in critical condition with severe burns and electrical injuries. I stared at the ceiling tiles and counted them while the doctor kept talking about my injuries and recovery timeline. Counting was easier than thinking about those families getting phone calls that their husbands and fathers weren't coming home. My boss showed up that afternoon and he looked like he'd aged 10 years since I last saw him. He sat in the chair next to my bed without saying anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. The company's insurance was covering everything for all the injured workers and the families of the men who died. He told me he should have sent backup when the plant manager gave me trouble. He should have known they wouldn't listen to a woman telling them their equipment was dangerous. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, but my throat hurt too much to say anything. A different nurse came in later and told me something that made my chest feel tight. My safety bypass gave the workers about 40 seconds of warning before the catastrophic failure. Those 40 seconds meant 5 people got far enough away from the transformer to survive the worst of the blast. 5 people who would have died if I hadn't installed that temporary fix. The nurse said I saved lives even though it didn't feel that way lying there with burns on my arms and 2 men dead. Rebecca Norwood came to check on me around dinner time. She was my trauma surgeon and she looked tired but kind. She examined my bandages and explained that my injuries would heal, but I needed to stay off my feet for at least 6 weeks. The burns on my forearms would scar permanently, and she couldn't promise my hearing would fully recover. The ringing might be permanent or it might fade over time. She said I was lucky to be alive considering how close I was to the blast. Lucky didn't feel like the right word. My dad visited after Rebecca left, and he just pulled a chair up next to my bed and held my hand without saying anything at first. His hands were rough and scarred from his own years as an electrician before his back injury ended his career. He understood what it meant to be right about safety and have people ignore you until disaster strikes. He'd watched 3 co-workers die in a crane collapse when he was my age because someone bypassed a safety system to save time. We sat there in silence for maybe 20 minutes before he finally spoke and told me it wasn't my fault. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't stop seeing Dustin flip that breaker and the plant manager's smug smile right before everything exploded. The plant manager showed up the next morning trying to get me to sign paperwork about the incident. He stood at the foot of my bed holding a folder and started talking about liability and insurance claims. Rebecca walked in right in the middle of his speech and her face went hard. She told him to get out of my room immediately, and when he didn't move fast enough, she called hospital security. 2 guards escorted him out while he protested that he just needed my signature on a few forms. Rebecca told the security desk that he wasn't allowed back in my room under any circumstances. She stood there for a minute after he left and asked if I was okay. I nodded, even though I wasn't okay at all. Reed Lockwood from OSHA came to take my statement while I was still stuck in that hospital bed. He set up a recording device on the table next to me and asked me to describe everything that happened from the moment I arrived at the plant. I told him about the heat damage on the transformer and the bypassed safety systems. I told him about warning them it would fail, and the plant manager calling me hysterical. Reed wrote everything down methodically, and I could tell from his questions that he already knew the plant was operating unsafely. He'd probably seen the maintenance logs and the thermal readings and all the evidence of violations. He just needed my first-hand account to complete his investigation. A nurse I didn't recognize came in that evening with information I'd been dreading. Dustin lost his right arm below the elbow and had burns over 40% of his body. He was stable now, but facing months of recovery and rehabilitation. One of the workers who died was only 23 years old with a pregnant wife who would never meet her baby's father. The other man who died had 3 kids under 10. I turned my face toward the wall so the nurse wouldn't see me crying. The guilt hit me harder than any physical pain from my burns or my concussion. I kept thinking I should have done more. I should have refused to leave that plant. I should have called the fire department or OSHA or found some way to physically prevent them from turning on that equipment. I could have grabbed the breaker myself or cut the power at the main panel. I could have stood in front of the transformer and refused to move. Maybe they would have listened if I'd been more forceful or more aggressive. Maybe those 2 men would still be alive if I'd just done something different. The ringing in my ears got louder every time I thought about it, and I couldn't make it stop. My dad showed up the next morning and pulled a chair right up next to the bed. He sat there quiet for a while just looking at my bandaged arms and the hearing aids the hospital gave me. Then he started telling me about a crane collapse at his job site when he was 32. 3 guys died that day because someone bypassed the weight limit sensors to save time on a big contract. He'd warned the foreman it was dangerous but got told to mind his own business and let the engineers handle it. The crane's main cable snapped during a lift and the whole thing came down on the crew below. My dad said he spent years thinking he should have done more, should have refused to work, should have called OSHA himself instead of trusting the foreman. He looked me straight in the eye and told me I did everything right and those men made their own choice to ignore me. That didn't make the guilt go away, but it helped knowing my dad understood exactly how it felt. Reed came back 2 days later carrying a folder full of photos from the plant. He spread them out on the table next to my bed and showed me the transformer wreckage. The whole thing had basically melted from the inside out, and the safety systems I'd tried to warn them about were completely destroyed. Reed pointed to my temporary bypass wiring in one of the photos and explained that it had held just long enough to give people a few extra seconds of warning before the catastrophic failure. He said his preliminary investigation suggested my work probably saved a dozen lives by preventing an even bigger cascade failure that would have taken out the entire electrical system. The plant's backup generators would have failed too, and everyone inside would have been trapped in total darkness with live electrical fires. I stared at those photos and tried to feel good about saving people, but all I could think about was the two who died anyway. My boss visited that afternoon and told me the company was offering full pay during my entire recovery period. They wanted me to consult on the investigation once I was feeling better and help them understand what went wrong. He sat down and lowered his voice before telling me the plant manager had been fired within 24 hours of the explosion. The facility was completely shut down pending a full safety review, and the manufacturing company that owned it was facing serious legal trouble. My boss said corporate was taking this incredibly seriously because they didn't want their reputation destroyed by what happened. He asked if I needed anything, and I told him I just needed time to heal and figure out if I'd ever be able to work again. 2 weeks after the explosion, Rebecca cleared me to go home but warned me I'd need help with basic stuff for a while. My burns were healing, but the scar tissue was tight and painful, and my hearing still had this constant ringing that drove me crazy. My dad packed up my hospital room and drove me back to my apartment. He'd already moved some of his things in and set up the guest room because he knew I couldn't manage alone yet. Simple things like opening jars or carrying groceries were nearly impossible with my burned arms. My dad helped me shower because I couldn't lift my arms high enough to wash my hair. He cooked all my meals and drove me to follow-up appointments and never once made me feel like a burden even though I felt useless. A workers' compensation attorney named Lance Medina called my cell phone 3 days after I got home. He explained that he was representing the injured workers in a lawsuit against the plant and the manufacturing company. Lance said my testimony about the ignored warnings would be crucial to proving negligence and getting fair compensation for everyone who got hurt. He'd already talked to Dustin and 2 other injured workers, and they all mentioned that I'd tried to stop them. Lance told me he'd reviewed the thermal readings I'd taken and Reed's preliminary findings, and the case was extremely strong. The plant had ignored clear expert warnings and people died because of it. I told Lance I wanted to help, but I needed to focus on healing first before I could deal with lawyers and depositions. He said he completely understood, and the legal process would take months anyway, so there was plenty of time. Lance gave me his direct number and told me to call whenever I felt ready to talk about what happened. He said the most important thing right now was my recovery, and everything else could wait. I appreciated that he didn't push me because I was barely holding myself together as it was. A woman called through the hospital's patient services line asking to speak with me. She introduced herself as Dustin's wife and said she wanted to thank me for trying to stop them. Her voice shook when she told me that Dustin had been talking to her from his hospital bed about what happened. He'd told her I was right about everything, and he was an arrogant fool who didn't listen. She said Dustin kept saying he should have backed me up instead of laughing at my warnings. I didn't know what to say to her because what could I possibly say that would make any of this better? She thanked me for dragging him away from the panel after the first explosion, and said the doctors told her those few seconds probably saved his life. We talked for maybe 10 minutes before I had to hang up because I couldn't stop crying. My first physical therapy appointment was with a therapist named Cindy Velez at the rehabilitation center across town. My dad drove me there and waited in the lobby while Cindy examined my arms. She had me try to grip different objects and measured how much pressure I could apply. The scar tissue was tight and painful whenever I tried to move my arms through their full range of motion. Cindy showed me exercises to help stretch the tissue and rebuild strength, but she was honest about my limitations. She told me I might not ever have the same grip strength I had before the burns. The damage to the nerve endings and muscle tissue was significant, and some of it would be permanent. Cindy said we'd work together for the next several months, but I needed to prepare myself for the possibility that I wouldn't fully recover. The reality hit me hard during that first therapy session when I couldn't even squeeze a tennis ball properly. My career had been my whole identity for 15 years, and the thought of losing it felt like losing part of who I was. I'd followed in my dad's footsteps and worked my way up to senior electrician through skill and determination. Now I might not be able to hold tools steady enough to do the work safely. Cindy noticed me getting upset and reminded me that recovery takes time, but I knew she was just being kind. The look in her eyes told me she'd seen this before with other patients whose injuries ended their careers. Reed contacted me again about a month after the explosion to share his preliminary OSHA report before it went public. He came to my apartment and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop showing me the findings. The plant had 17 separate safety violations documented in their own maintenance logs. My warnings about the transformer were recorded in emails and work orders that proved I'd identified the exact problems that caused the failure. Reed said the plant manager had overridden multiple safety protocols and ignored expert recommendations from both me and their own maintenance staff. The facility's cooling systems had been failing for weeks, and someone had deliberately bypassed the automatic shutdown features to keep production running. Reed's report concluded that the explosion was entirely preventable and resulted from willful negligence rather than equipment malfunction. The news story broke 2 days after Reed showed me his report. I was home trying to do my physical therapy exercises when my phone started ringing. The first call was from Channel 7 asking for an interview about being the expert who warned about the explosion. I declined and hung up. 5 minutes later, Channel 4 called. Then a newspaper reporter. Then another TV station. By noon, my phone had rung 37 times, and I finally just unplugged it from the wall. My dad heard the landline ringing constantly, too, and came into my room asking what was going on. I showed him the news article on my tablet where my name was featured in bold letters as the senior electrician who identified the critical danger and were ignored. The story included quotes from Reed's preliminary report and made it clear I had done everything right while the plant manager had dismissed my warnings. My dad read it twice, then looked at me with this mix of pride and concern. He took my phone and plugged it back in long enough to change the voicemail message saying I was recovering and not available for interviews. Then he unplugged it again and told me I didn't owe anyone my story or my trauma, just because they wanted it for their news cycle. Over the next week, he screened every call and turned away 3 reporters who showed up at our door. He reminded me that what happened was mine to process and share only if and when I wanted to, not because strangers thought they deserved access to my pain. Jerry showed up at my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon about 3 weeks after the explosion. My dad answered the door and I heard him talking to someone before he came to ask if I was okay seeing visitors. I said yes, and Jerry walked in wearing a long-sleeved shirt despite the heat. His face and neck had burn scars that looked similar to mine, and he moved carefully like everything still hurt. He sat down across from me and we just looked at each other for a minute before he started talking. He told me he was farther from the panel when Dustin flipped the breaker, because he'd been checking a secondary connection. That extra 15 feet probably saved his life, though he still had second-degree burns on his arms and face. Jerry said he'd been thinking about that day constantly, and needed to talk to me about what happened. His hands shook when he started explaining what he remembered. Jerry told me he heard me screaming at them to stop right before Dustin flipped the switch. He said the plant manager had pulled him and the other guys aside earlier and told them I was being hysterical and emotional, like women always were about technical things. The plant manager said to ignore my warnings because I was just scared and didn't really understand the equipment like the men who worked there every day did. Jerry admitted he'd believed it at the time because the plant manager seemed so confident and I seemed so panicked. Now he realized my panic was completely justified and their confidence was just arrogance. He apologized for not backing me up and said he'd testify to exactly what happened if anyone asked. He wanted the truth on record that I'd done everything possible to stop them, and they'd ignored me because of who I was rather than what I knew. I thanked him and told him I was glad he survived. We talked for another hour about our injuries and recovery before he left. Lance called me the following week to tell me the families of the 2 workers who died had filed wrongful death lawsuits against both the plant and the manufacturing company that owned it. He said the cases were strong given Reed's OSHA report and the documented evidence of my warnings being ignored. Lance explained I'd likely be called as an expert witness to testify about the technical failures and the safety protocols that were violated. He asked if I was okay with that, and I said yes, because those families deserved justice and compensation for losing their husbands and fathers. Lance told me the legal process would take months, but he'd keep me updated on any developments. 6 weeks after the explosion, I went back to see Rebecca for my follow-up appointment. She examined my arms first and said the burns were healing well, though the scars would be permanent. Then she tested my hearing with different tones and frequencies. I could tell from her face that the results weren't good before she even said anything. Rebecca sat down and explained that my hearing had been damaged by the blast pressure, and I'd lost significant range in both ears, especially in the higher frequencies. She asked me questions about my work and what kind of environments I typically worked in. When I described the loud industrial settings and the importance of hearing equipment sounds and warning signals, she got quiet for a moment. Then she told me as gently as she could that returning to high-voltage electrical work might not be safe anymore given my reduced hearing. I could miss critical warning sounds or fail to hear someone shouting an alert. The risk was too high for both me and anyone working near me. The news hit me harder than anything else had since waking up in the hospital. I drove home in a daze and went straight to my room. My dad knocked on the door an hour later and found me crying for the first time since the explosion. I told him what Rebecca had said and how my career was over at 37 years old. Everything I'd built for 15 years was gone. The legacy I'd been carrying on from him was finished. I'd worked so hard to prove myself in a field that didn't want women, and now I couldn't even do the work anymore. My dad sat on the bed next to me and let me cry until I couldn't anymore. Later that evening, my dad shared his own story about when his back injury ended his career at 42. He described the depression that followed, and the anger he felt at having his identity stripped away. For months, he didn't know who he was if he wasn't an electrician. He told me about the dark period where he barely left the house and pushed everyone away. But eventually, he found new purpose in teaching safety courses and training the next generation of electricians. He said it took him almost 2 years to accept that his worth wasn't just in doing the physical work, but in sharing what he knew. He reminded me I had knowledge and experience that could help others even if I couldn't work with high-voltage systems anymore. It didn't make the loss hurt less, but it helped knowing he understood exactly what I was going through. At my next physical therapy session, Cindy adjusted my treatment plan to focus specifically on the movements I'd need for electrical work. She had me practice gripping tools and manipulating small wires and components. After an hour of exercises, she sat me down and gave me her honest assessment. My grip strength was at about 70% of what it had been before the burns, and it probably wouldn't improve much more. The nerve damage and scar tissue had created permanent limitations. She said 70% might be enough for some types of electrical work, but not for the precision and strength required in industrial settings. Cindy apologized for not having better news and promised we'd keep working to maintain what function I had. 2 days later, representatives from the plant's insurance company showed up at my apartment with their lawyers. They wanted to interview me about the incident for their investigation. I let them in and answered their questions for over an hour. They kept trying to suggest I hadn't communicated the danger clearly enough, or that maybe I'd overestimated the risk. One lawyer asked if I was certain about my assessment given that the plant's own maintenance team had disagreed with me. I pulled out my phone and showed them the photos I'd taken of the thermal readings and the degraded insulation. I walked them through my documented warnings in the emails I'd sent, and the verbal warnings multiple witnesses had heard. When they kept pushing, I mentioned Reed's OSHA investigation and how his findings backed up everything I'd said. That shut down their questions pretty fast, and they left shortly after. My dad had been listening from the kitchen and came in after they left to tell me I'd handled them perfectly. The next week, Lance called and asked me to come to his office to go over the legal case. I drove across town and met him in a small conference room with stacks of documents covering the table. He spread out papers showing the plant manager's official statement claiming I had overreacted to routine maintenance issues and caused unnecessary panic that disrupted their operations. Lance pointed to highlighted sections where the manager insisted the transformer was functioning within normal parameters, and my warnings were based on inexperience with their specific equipment. I felt my face get hot reading his lies, but Lance told me to stay calm because we had everything we needed to prove otherwise. He pulled out the plant's own maintenance logs showing 3 separate warnings from their staff about cooling system failures over the past 2 months. Then he showed me Reed's preliminary investigation report documenting the degraded insulation and bypassed safety systems exactly as I had described. Lance explained that the company's own records proved they knew about the danger and ignored it, and my expert assessment was completely accurate. He said the plant manager was trying to shift blame to avoid criminal negligence charges, but the evidence made his defense impossible. We spent 3 hours going through every detail of that day, and Lance recorded my account of each warning I gave, and each time they dismissed me. He told me the legal proceedings would take months, but the outcome was almost certain given the documentation and Reed's findings. 3 months after the explosion, I got an invitation to a memorial service for the 2 workers who died. I almost didn't go because the thought of facing their families made me feel sick, but my dad said they deserved to have me there, so I put on a black dress and drove to the church. The service was packed with coworkers and family members, and I sat in the back trying to be invisible. Both men had young kids, and watching their children cry during the eulogies broke something inside me. After the service, people gathered in the fellowship hall, and I stood in the corner holding a paper cup of coffee I couldn't drink. Several family members came up to thank me for trying to save their loved ones, and I could barely speak because all I could think about was how I failed. One of the men's brothers shook my hand and told me he heard I dragged people away from the blast even after getting injured myself. I just nodded because I didn't trust my voice. Then one of the widows approached me and asked if we could talk privately. We stepped outside into the parking lot, and she pulled out her phone to show me a text message. Her husband had sent it to her about 20 minutes before the explosion. The message said some woman electrician was causing drama about the equipment and making everyone wait around instead of just letting them do their jobs. She looked at me with tears running down her face and said she wished he had listened to the drama instead of dismissing it as nothing. She told me she didn't blame me at all and that her husband had a habit of not taking women seriously in technical fields. She said if he had respected my expertise, he would still be alive, and she wanted me to know that his death wasn't my fault. I started crying right there in the parking lot, and she hugged me while we both cried together. She thanked me for trying to stop them and said she hoped I wouldn't carry guilt that belonged to the men who ignored me. 2 weeks later, I got a call from a woman who introduced herself as Dustin's wife. She said Dustin had been struggling with guilt and kept asking about me and wondering if I was okay. She explained that he wanted to apologize in person for not listening when it mattered, but he was afraid I wouldn't want to see him. I told her I would meet with him, and she gave me the address of a coffee shop near the rehab center where he was doing therapy. She said he was learning to use a prosthetic arm and having a hard time accepting what happened. I agreed to meet him the following Tuesday. When I walked into the coffee shop 4 months after the explosion, I barely recognized Dustin sitting at a corner table. He looked 20 years older with gray in his hair that hadn't been there before, and deep lines around his eyes. His right sleeve was pinned up where his arm used to be, and he was staring at the table like he was afraid to look up. I sat down across from him, and he finally raised his eyes to meet mine. We just looked at each other for a long moment before he started talking. He told me he replayed that day constantly in his head, and saw my face when I begged them to stop. He said the image of me grabbing the plant manager's arm and pleading kept him awake most nights. He described how he remembered laughing at me and telling me to relax about a little spark right before the world exploded in white light. His voice cracked when he said his arrogance cost him his arm and killed 2 good men and nearly killed everyone else in that building. He said he couldn't forgive himself for being so stupid and dismissive when someone with more experience was trying to save his life. He kept apologizing over and over and saying he wished he could go back and listen to me. I let him finish talking before I responded. I told him I didn't blame him personally because the plant manager created the whole culture where my warnings got dismissed as hysteria. I explained how that manager set the tone by mocking me from the moment I arrived and calling me little lady and sweetheart. I said the manager made it acceptable for everyone to ignore my expertise because I was a woman. But I also told Dustin I wasn't going to completely absolve him because he made his own choice to ignore me, even after I installed the safety bypass and warned them one final time. I said he was a grown man with 20 years of experience, and he chose to trust the plant manager's dismissal over my expert assessment. We both had to live with the consequences of the choices made that day. We ended up talking for 2 hours about the incident, and our injuries, and what our futures looked like now. Dustin told me he was retrained for office work doing scheduling and inventory management because he couldn't do hands-on maintenance anymore. He said losing his career felt almost as bad as losing his arm, because being an electrician was his whole identity. I understood exactly what he meant because I was facing the same thing with my hearing damage and reduced grip strength. We talked about how we both might never work in the field again, and how that felt like losing part of ourselves. He asked if I was angry at him, and I said I was more angry at the system that made my warnings easy to ignore. But I admitted I was also frustrated that he didn't back me up when it could have made a difference. Near the end of our conversation, Jerry walked into the coffee shop and spotted us. He came over and asked if he could join, and we both said yes. Jerry had burns on his face and neck that were still healing, and he said he was doing physical therapy 3 times a week. The 3 of us sat there as survivors trying to make sense of what happened and who we were now. Jerry said he heard me screaming at them to stop, but the plant manager told them I was being hysterical, so he ignored it too. He apologized for not backing me up and said he would testify to exactly what happened if it helped the case. We talked about forming a support group for industrial workers who survived accidents and how we could advocate for better safety culture. It felt strange bonding with the men who hadn't listened to me, but we were connected now through shared trauma and permanent scars. The next week, Reed's final OSHA report got released to the public. I downloaded it immediately and read through all 47 pages documenting 17 separate violations at the plant. The report specifically cited the plant manager's dismissal of my expert warnings as a contributing factor to the deaths and injuries. It described how I had correctly identified critical danger and provided explicit instructions to shut down the equipment. The report stated that my temporary safety bypass had prevented additional casualties by giving workers crucial seconds to get away from the blast. Reed's investigation found that the plant had been operating with known cooling system failures for 8 weeks, and multiple internal warnings had been ignored by management. The facility got fined $3 million, and the plant manager faced potential criminal charges for negligent homicide. Reading that report felt like vindication, but it didn't bring back the 2 men who died or give Dustin his arm back or fix my hearing. I was right about everything, but being right came with a cost I would carry forever. 2 weeks later, Lance called to tell me the manufacturing company settled both wrongful death lawsuits before they could go to trial. He said the families got substantial money, but he sounded tired when he said it, like he knew no settlement could bring back a 23-year-old with a pregnant wife or a father of 3 who coached Little League. The amount stayed private, but Lance mentioned the company wanted to avoid a public trial, where my testimony would detail exactly how their plant manager were ignored explicit safety warnings and caused 2 deaths. I asked if that meant it was over, and Lance said not even close because the workers' compensation cases were just getting started. He needed me to give a deposition for all the injured workers, including Dustin and Jerry, and the 2 others who survived the blast. I agreed immediately because those guys deserved every cent they could get after what happened to them. The deposition took place in a conference room downtown with Lance on one side of the table and 3 lawyers from the plant's insurance company on the other side. A court reporter sat at the end typing everything I said into her little machine. Lance walked me through my qualifications first, my 15 years of experience, my certifications for industrial systems, my father's legacy in the field. Then he asked me to describe what I found at the plant that day, and I went through it step by step. The bypassed safety systems, the heat damage on the transformer, the degraded insulation, my explicit warnings that someone could die if they energized the equipment. I explained the temporary safety bypass I installed, and how I told them it only bought seconds before catastrophic failure. The insurance lawyers took over after lunch and their questions got hostile fast. One of them, a woman in an expensive suit, asked if I was certain I had assessed the danger correctly given the pressure of the situation. I told her I was absolutely certain because I had 15 years of experience identifying electrical hazards, and this was textbook transformer failure. She asked if being the only woman on site that day might have made me feel defensive and caused me to overstate the risk. Lance objected before I could answer and reminded everyone that the OSHA report confirmed every single one of my assessments. Another lawyer asked if I had proper training to evaluate industrial transformers of that size, and I listed my certifications one by one while staring right at him. They tried for 3 more hours to find some crack in my testimony, some way to suggest I had been wrong or hysterical or incompetent. But Reed had already documented everything in his investigation, and my warnings were in the plant's own maintenance logs written down by their staff. By the time we finished, it was past 6 in the evening, and I felt completely drained. Lance walked me to my car and said I did great, that my testimony was solid and the insurance company was going to have a hard time denying these claims. 3 days later, the plant manager's lawyers requested their own deposition to challenge my qualifications. Lance said they were going to argue that a woman couldn't accurately assess the danger of heavy industrial equipment. I felt my blood pressure spike when he told me that, but Lance said not to worry because he was bringing Reed to testify about the investigation, and my dad volunteered to come talk about my training and the family expertise. The second deposition felt like a battle from the first question. The plant manager's lead attorney asked if I had ever worked on a transformer that large before, and I said yes, multiple times. He asked if I had been intimidated by the plant manager's confidence and deferred to his judgment. I said no. I had been horrified by his ignorance and tried desperately to stop him from killing his workers. Reed testified after me and walked through the OSHA investigation in excruciating detail. He explained that my assessment had been completely accurate, that the transformer was in critical failure state, and that my temporary safety bypass had prevented even more casualties by giving workers crucial seconds to escape. My dad testified last and talked about teaching me electrical work from the time I was 12 years old, about how I had learned the trade the same way he did, through years of hands-on experience and formal training. He said I was a better electrician than he ever was, and that any suggestion otherwise was insulting to both of us. The plant manager's lawyers didn't have much to say after that. 4 months after the explosion, Rebecca cleared me to return to light-duty work. My burns had healed as much as they were going to, and my hearing had stabilized even though I needed hearing aids now. My boss called me into his office the day after I got medical clearance and offered me a position in safety training and inspection instead of hands-on electrical work. He said the company needed someone who understood the real consequences of ignored safety warnings and who could teach others to take expert advice seriously. I sat in his office feeling like someone had punched me in the stomach because accepting that position meant admitting I would never work in the field again. I told him I needed time to think about it and drove straight to my dad's house. He was in his workshop organizing tools when I got there, and I just stood in the doorway trying not to cry. He looked at me and knew immediately what was wrong. I told him about the job offer and how it felt like giving up, like admitting defeat after fighting so hard to prove myself as an electrician. My dad put down the wrench he was holding and said teaching others to avoid disasters was just as important as fixing electrical systems. He reminded me that he had struggled with the same feelings when his back injury ended his career, that he had felt worthless and lost until he started teaching safety courses. He said I could honor the men who died by making sure their deaths meant something, by teaching the next generation to listen when experts warn them about danger. I cried in his workshop for 20 minutes while he just sat there with me. Cindy finished my physical therapy 2 days later with the honest news that I had recovered as much as I was going to. My hearing was permanently reduced even with the hearing aids, and my grip strength topped out at 75% of what it used to be. She said I could maintain that level with regular exercise, but I would never have the same strength I had before the explosion. I asked if she thought I could safely do hands-on electrical work, and she was quiet for a long moment before saying probably not with heavy industrial equipment. The reduced hearing meant I might miss warning sounds, and the grip strength issue could be dangerous when handling large components. I thanked her for being honest, even though hearing it out loud made it feel more real. I called my boss that afternoon and accepted the safety training position. He sounded relieved and said I could start developing curriculum right away, that I should take whatever time I needed to create something meaningful. I spent the next week at my kitchen table writing lesson plans based on everything that happened at that plant. My first lesson focused entirely on listening to expert warnings regardless of who delivered them, on recognizing that expertise and experience mattered more than gender or ego. I included photos from Reed's investigation showing the destroyed transformer and my temporary safety bypass that bought those crucial seconds. I wrote case studies about the 2 men who died and the permanent injuries suffered by the survivors. The Workers' Compensation Board scheduled hearings for all the injured workers 6 weeks after I accepted the new position. Lance called to prepare me for testimony and said the hearings would be more formal than the depositions. I showed up at the administrative building downtown, wearing my hearing aids visibly, and a long-sleeved shirt that still showed the burn scars on my wrists. The hearing room looked like a small courtroom with the 3 board members sitting at a raised desk and witness chairs facing them. I testified first about the unsafe conditions at the plant manager's refusal to shut down the equipment, and my explicit warnings about the danger. I described watching them ignore me and flip that breaker, seeing the first explosion, dragging Dustin away from the second blast. One of the board members asked why I thought my warnings were dismissed, and I said honestly that the plant manager made it clear he didn't believe a woman could assess industrial equipment accurately. Dustin testified next, and I watched from the back of the room as he described ignoring my warnings because the plant manager told him I was being hysterical. He said he had 20 years of experience and he thought he knew better than some woman his boss had called to fix the problem. Dustin's voice broke when he talked about waking up in the hospital without his arm and realizing I had been right about everything. He said the culture at that plant treated women's expertise as less valid, and he had bought into that thinking until it cost him his arm and killed 2 of his co-workers. Jerry testified after Dustin and gave a similar account. He said he heard me screaming at them to stop, but the plant manager waved him off and said I was being emotional and dramatic. Jerry described seeing the first explosion and thinking in that split second that he should have listened to me. His honest testimony about his own mistakes and the dismissive culture at the plant seemed to affect the board members deeply. The hearings lasted 3 days total with testimony from all the injured workers, medical experts about their injuries, and vocational specialists about their reduced earning capacity. The board deliberated for 2 weeks before issuing their ruling. Lance called me the morning the decision came out and said the board ruled in favor of all the injured workers with substantial settlements for medical costs, lost wages, and permanent disability. Dustin's settlement was the largest because losing his arm meant he could never return to maintenance work and would need ongoing medical care for the rest of his life. The board's written decision specifically cited the plant manager's dismissal of my expert warnings and the unsafe culture that prioritized production over worker safety. Reading that decision felt like validation, but it didn't erase the nightmares about the explosion or bring back my full hearing or give me back the career I had built for 15 years. 6 months after the explosion, I stood in front of my first safety training class holding a stack of photos from the incident scene. 20 industrial electricians sat in rows of folding chairs watching me with the kind of careful attention I never got when I showed up with my toolkit. I placed the first photo on the overhead projector showing the destroyed transformer panel. The burns on my forearms were visible below my short sleeves, and I caught several students staring at the scars before looking away. I told them exactly what happened that Tuesday without making it sound better than it was. I described the plant manager blocking the door and laughing at my credentials. I explained how I identified the heat damage and bypassed safety systems and warned them the transformer would fail. I showed them the thermal readings I took and the temporary bypass I installed to buy them seconds. Then I showed them photos of the explosion aftermath and told them 2 men died because the plant manager decided a woman couldn't assess industrial equipment accurately. One student in the back row shifted in his seat and I saw him glance at the guy next to him. I explained how Dustin lost his arm and 3 others got severe burns, and how I dragged people away from the second blast before the third one hit me. The room stayed completely quiet while I talked, and nobody checked their phones or whispered to each other like I'd seen in other training sessions I'd attended over the years. I finished by showing them a photo of the safety protocol violation list from Reed's OSHA report. 17 separate violations that the plant's own maintenance logs documented. I told them the plant manager ignored expert warnings because he thought being male meant knowing more than a woman with 15 years experience. When I asked if anyone had questions, an older electrician in the front row raised his hand. He said he'd been in the trade for 30 years and had dismissed younger workers' concerns before because he thought experience trumped fresh perspective. He thanked me for sharing my story and said he'd never ignore a safety warning again, regardless of who delivered it. 3 other electricians came up after class ended and told me similar things. One guy said he'd worked with female electricians who knew more than him, but he'd never fully respected their expertise until hearing what happened when that expertise got dismissed. Another told me about a time he'd overridden a safety concern from a newer worker and got lucky that nothing bad happened. The respect in their voices felt strange after 15 years of fighting to be taken seriously on job sites. My boss called me into his office the next week and asked me to develop a company-wide protocol for safety concerns raised by any employee. He wanted mandatory shutdown authority for certified experts who identified critical dangers. I spent 2 weeks drafting the policy and running it past our legal team and insurance representatives. The final version required any certified expert to have the power to shut down equipment immediately if they identified a critical safety risk. Management could override the shutdown, but only after getting verification from an independent third-party expert. The policy also included protection from retaliation for workers who raised safety concerns. My boss implemented it across all our contracts and sent copies to every client we worked with. Reed contacted me a month later, asking if I'd help create training materials that OSHA could use nationally. He said my experience demonstrated the deadly consequences of dismissing expert warnings based on gender bias, and he wanted to turn it into a case study. We spent 6 weeks developing a 4-hour training module that covered gender bias in safety-critical industries, the importance of listening to expert warnings, and the legal and human costs of ignoring safety concerns. The training included video of me describing the explosion and testimony from Dustin about ignoring my warnings. Reed told me OSHA planned to make the training mandatory for all industrial facility managers starting next quarter. 7 months after the explosion, I drove to the rehabilitation center where Dustin was finishing his occupational therapy. I found him in the therapy gym working with his prosthetic arm to pick up small objects. He'd adapted remarkably well and could grip a coffee cup and manipulate tools with decent precision. He saw me watching and waved me over with his prosthetic. We sat in the cafeteria and he told me about his new office job starting next week doing safety compliance reviews for an industrial consulting firm. He said losing his arm meant he couldn't do maintenance work anymore, but it also gave him a chance to prevent other people from making his mistakes. Then he told me something that surprised me. He'd been meeting regularly with the widow of one of the workers who died in the explosion. She'd reached out wanting to understand exactly what happened and why her husband died. Dustin said he'd explained everything, including how he dismissed my warnings, because the plant manager told him I was being hysterical. The widow asked him to speak at safety conferences about the cost of arrogance, and he'd already done 2 presentations. He showed me his speaking schedule for the next 6 months with conferences in 8 different states. Jerry had returned to maintenance work but now served as a safety liaison who reviewed all expert warnings before any equipment restart. I ran into him at a job site where my company was doing an inspection, and he pulled me aside to talk. He said our experience taught him that expertise mattered more than ego, and he'd made it his mission to make sure every warning got taken seriously. He'd already stopped 3 unsafe restarts by insisting on independent verification. The manufacturing company that owned the plant where the explosion happened implemented new policies requiring outside expert verification before overriding any safety shutdown recommendation. Their corporate safety director called me to discuss the policy changes and specifically mentioned my case as the reason for the new requirements. He said they were rolling out the policy across all 40 of their facilities nationwide. 8 months after the explosion, I got an invitation to speak at a national industrial safety conference in Chicago. The conference director said they wanted me to present on gender bias in safety-critical industries and the consequences of dismissing expert warnings. I was nervous about speaking to hundreds of safety professionals, but I agreed because sharing my experience might prevent similar disasters. I spent 3 weeks preparing my presentation with help from Reed and input from Dustin and Jerry. My conference presentation focused on how gender bias in industrial settings could have deadly consequences when it caused people to dismiss expert warnings. I stood on stage with my scarred arms visible and my hearing aids showing and told my story to a room of 400 safety professionals. I showed the same photos I used in my training classes and played video testimony from Dustin about ignoring my warnings. I explained how the plant manager's assumption that women couldn't assess industrial equipment accurately led directly to 2 deaths and multiple serious injuries. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with a standing ovation that lasted almost 2 minutes. After my presentation ended, I got surrounded by conference attendees asking questions and requesting copies of my training materials. Representatives from 6 different companies asked if I could deliver my training at their facilities. 3 industry publications wanted to interview me about gender bias in industrial safety. A woman from a major manufacturing company told me she'd faced similar dismissal of her expertise, and my presentation validated her experience. The conference director told me they wanted me back next year as a keynote speaker. 2 weeks after Chicago, I got an email from a woman in Texas who attended my presentation. She wrote that she'd been dismissed by her crew for 3 years, but my story gave her courage to file a formal safety complaint about ignored warnings at her facility. The complaint triggered an inspection that found 12 violations and prevented what investigators said would have been a likely explosion within months. Reading her email, I understood something important. As a hands-on electrician, I could fix maybe 20 systems a year across different facilities, but through training and advocacy, I was reaching hundreds of electricians who would each make better decisions for decades. The grief over losing my career didn't disappear, but it got easier knowing the explosion pushed me toward work that might save more lives than I ever could have working alone with my tools. My dad showed up unannounced to one of my training sessions 3 weeks later. I was halfway through presenting the transformer case study when I noticed him standing in the back of the room with his arms crossed and a slight smile on his face. After class ended, he waited until the other attendees left before walking up to the front. He looked at my training materials spread across the table, and then at the photos of the explosion damage still displayed on the screen behind me. He pulled me into a hug and said he was proud of how I turned the worst thing that ever happened to me into something that mattered. He told me I was carrying on the family legacy just like he'd always hoped, but in a way that was probably more important than anything he'd done in his 30 years of electrical work. We went to dinner that night and talked for 3 hours about how both our careers ended because of workplace injuries, but how we'd both found ways to keep contributing to the field we loved. 9 months after the explosion, I got a call from Reed telling me OSHA was giving me their Safety Innovation Award for my training program and advocacy work. The ceremony was in Washington, D.C., with about 200 safety professionals and government officials attending. Reed presented the award himself and told everyone in the room that my warnings at the plant saved 5 lives, even though they weren't listened to in time to save everyone. He said my work since then was changing how the entire industry approached expert warnings and gender bias in safety-critical decisions. I stood at the podium holding the award with my scarred forearms visible on both sides of the plaque and my hearing aids clearly showing. I told my story to the room full of safety professionals without sugarcoating what happened or pretending the outcome was anything but terrible. The explosion changed everything about my life and my career in ways I'm still processing and probably always will be. But it also gave me a platform to prevent future tragedies and honor the 2 men who died because their manager valued his ego over their safety. I'm not the same person I was before that Tuesday, and I never will be. The confident electrician who walked into that plant doesn't exist anymore. But I found a way to turn the worst day of my life into work that means something, and that has to be enough.